Good evening from Wolfville and Mi'kma'ki, the ancestral and unceded territory of the Mi'kmaq people. Fall is most definitely in the air, and while it is not like the September that we all know and look forward to, I can assure you from sitting here in the center of Wolfville that is certainly more lively this week or in the last week or two, and we are starting to see our students come back, those of us who will be joining us in person this year. Versus virtually. So it still has a very similar feel to what we all know and love about Wolfville in the September month. My name is Oonagh Proudfoot, and I'm the Executive Director of Alumni Affairs in the Office of Advancement at Acadia, and I am the class of 1993 and 2006. I'm delighted to be here with you this evening to interview someone we all know and love, and who usually finds himself on the other side of the microphone, so to speak. Before we get started on the topic content and introducing this evening's speaker, I will cover a few housekeeping items. For those of you who are regulars, you've heard this before, so bear with me as I repeat it for anyone who's new on the line with us this evening. We ask that you please mute your microphones. It avoids the background noise that you're often not aware of happening behind you in your homes and with your families, and it certainly muffles up the sound quality for the recording and for our guests this evening. We also ask that you disable your camera. That is to help us also with the recording, but also with bandwidth. And I made the joke already earlier that I have no idea what that means, but apparently it's a thing. So please disable your camera. That's not to say that we are not encouraging you to ask questions at any point throughout the course of the discussion with our guest speaker here this evening. We'd love to hear your questions, and if you're not comfortable sharing them by taking your mute function off, please check the chat function on the usually on the right hand side of your screen, and it appears simply by clicking the icon that looks like a conversation box. For many of you, it will be at the top right hand portion of your screen. For some of you, it may be in a bar that shows up across the middle of your screen. So if you have a question at any point in time, please feel free to write it in the chat function, and I will do my best to keep an eye out for it while I entertain and interview our guest speaker this evening. The only other piece to mention is that we have entered all of your names into a draw, and we have a winner to announce that we will send some Acadia alumni swag to in the coming weeks, and we will announce that winner at the end so that you will know that you're the winner. And if you by chance are not on the line, and I have Sandra Simmons with me keeping an eye administratively, we have a second and a third name that we can move on to. So we will be sending that swag package off to somebody. So now we get to the nitty-gritty of the evening, and I am delighted to say that joining me here and join me in welcoming Len Hawley. You'll hear announcing both our home and our away games, and for those of you who regularly attend the hockey celebrity dinner, Len is the person interviewing the guests. Well, today, as I say, I have the honor of interviewing Len and allowing our guests to get up close and personal with the voice of Acadia hockey. So we will get to that after I introduce him and tell you a little bit about Len Hawley, but not too much, because of course we need to get some goods from him throughout the course of the evening. Len was born in Halifax to a military family and grew up experiencing life across Canada. After graduating high school in Lunenburg, he completed the radio and television arts program at King's Tech Community College in Kentville. While studying, he began his career with Annapolis Valley Radio, where he served in various capacities and is widely known as the voice of the Acadia Axemen hockey. In January 2013, after 28 years in broadcasting, Len accepted the position of Marketing and Development with Acadia University Athletics. He enjoys taking an active part in the community, where he is involved in many fundraising efforts, including chairing the annual Acadia Axemen Celebrity Hockey Dinner. And in 1994, his passion for the music business led him into managing popular Annapolis Valley recording artist Rachel McLean. Len and his family happily reside in Kentville. So there's a very brief introduction of our guest of honor this evening. And Len, before we get into some of the questions that I'm going to direct to you and hopefully facilitate additional questions from folks on the line, we recognize you certainly as the voice of Acadia Axemen hockey, and your fans out there this evening certainly want to get to know you better and hear some of your stories. But before we get started, I think it prudent for us to acknowledge another hockey staple in our community, and that is Rick Daniels, who sadly passed away earlier this summer. For those of you out there who may not know who we mean by name, you will know who we mean when we say he's the guy who never missed a home game and was the owner of the loudest horn ever heard at every home game of the Acadia Axemen. So I think it's fair to say it won't be quite the same at our next game without Mr. Daniels there. Len, would you agree?
Absolutely. You could call Rick sort of like the seventh player on the ice, even though he wasn't on the ice. He knew how to intimidate the opposition when they came into our building. And I'll say over the years that Rick sat above where the visitors would enter the ice surface. There may have been a few verbal altercations in that time, and it was always a lot of fun. Now, hey, you know what? Rick's going to be really missed. And you're right. When hockey finally rolls around at Acadia, it's going to be a little different not to see him there.
It certainly will, and I know that you and I had a brief conversation about the Hall of Fame in the athletic complex, and hoping that we might be able to get our hands on that horn, thinking that it would be certainly a good contribution for the many years of Rick at those home games.
You know, it's funny you say that, Oonagh. You think about Dr. Cherry's cowbell and you think about Rick Daniels' horn. There's just certain objects that people have brought to games over the last number of decades. And you're right, that would be something we'd want to have.
Yep, absolutely. So listen, I gave you a little bit of a heads up on some of the questions that I was going to be asking you here this evening, but here's one thing I didn't give you the heads up on. So I'm hoping you and I can have some fun with this question and answer and the storytelling, but we're going to start with a rapid fire. So yeah, so for folks on the line who maybe don't know necessarily what a rapid fire is, that's where I quickly ask a question and Len is quickly going to give us an answer without thinking too much about it. Are you ready to play, Len? Are you willing to be a partner in crime on this one?
I have never been on this side of the rapid fire, so we'll see.
Here we go. What is your middle name?
Leonard.
Ooh, when is your birthday?
July 27th.
What's your favorite? I was not going to ask you the year. What's your favorite color?
Red.
Hamburger or hot dog?
Hamburger.
Country music or rock?
Country music.
Howard Cosell or Bob Cole?
Bob Cole.
Toronto Maple Leafs or Montreal Canadiens?
Oh, the Habs for sure.
I was hoping that I was going to get you on that one, Len. I must admit. So your middle name is Leonard. Well, then you're going to have to cough it up and give us your first name.
Colin. Yeah, I'm actually a junior. And you know what? You'd have to ask my mom why they did that, because after 56 years, I don't know. And I can tell you every time I've had to fill out a bank form or any other form, it confuses everybody involved, including me.
So, sorry, which part is the junior, Len or Colin?
Colin. My dad was Colin, and so it was Colin Leonard Hawley. And believe it or not, I was Leonard until I went to King's Tech. And then I just said, there's no way I'm opening up a microphone and referring to myself as Leonard. So I shortened it.
Well, listen, if you'd grown up in Newfoundland, it would have been shortened a lot sooner. And in fact, you probably would have been known as Junior. So, you know what, Len, when I think about your career and sort of having read your bio and read over some of the information that you provided for me, it struck me that you know, we don't get to this stage in our career without having some mentors along the way. And so that's going to be my first sort of intense question for you, or pointed question for you. Who would you say is one of your main mentors, one of your most influential people in your career path?
Well, certainly when I was in radio, it was a gentleman by the name of Dave Bannerman, who was in radio several years before I showed up on the scene, and he would have been my program director and music director and a few other items along the way in that career. But Dave was really the one that sort of introduced me how to paint a picture for people that were listening, and he really helped me with the hockey broadcasts, believe it or not. And every time he'd listen to me do those games in the early days, he'd always have a few notes for me when I would come back after the weekend. And so Dave from the radio end of things certainly would have been the person I always reflect on as being a mentor.
Wonderful. What about when you were actually, let me skip ahead a little bit and ask you, so what was your first connection to Acadia?
When the arena was built, and I still refer to it as the new arena, the Andrew H. McCain Arena, after 32 years, I still call it the new arena, which is funny. I was working for what was called Magic 97 at that time in Kentville. So this would have been 1988. And I'd heard about the arena, and I thought I'd love to have a little hobby because I'm obviously passionate about hockey, and to come in and maybe be the public address announcer. So I contacted Acadia and ended up connected to Hal Baird, who, by the way, would be another mentor for me. And Hal and I got to know each other, and he hired me without really knowing me. And relationship between me and Hal sort of blossomed, and the relationship between me and Acadia blossomed at that point.
So tell us a little bit more about Hal then, and how he became one of your mentors.
Well, I think Hal quickly, when Hal hired me, he sort of pointed out that, what they were looking for was more of a broadcast professional to do the game. So the new arena, they were sort of entering a whole new era. And so that was sort of what he was looking for. But on the sidebar, what people wouldn't have seen is that as Hal and I got to know each other, I would get involved a little bit on the side. Maybe it would be through the corporate sponsorships at the time. Hal would give me little tasks to do. And then there were certain projects that Acadia would host, for example, the Tim Hortons Cup, which was a university men's all-star hockey game. And myself and Bob Casey and Hal would huddle in an office at Hal's choosing, and we would map out the project. And so Hal really showed me how to, sort of produce timelines and roles and responsibilities. And so I give him a lot of credit. And, he was just happy that he never had to worry in the arena about me, because he knew that I would look after things, not just from the announcing, but sort of behind the scenes of things that needed to be done. And so, Hal was very instrumental in my relationship with Acadia.
So you started that, you said, in 88 or 89, somewhere around there, with the opening of the arena?
Yeah, the arena would have opened in the fall of 88, I believe it was.
Yeah, I think you're absolutely right. And the only reason I brought that up is because I had to segue into, that was when I started at Acadia myself. So I never knew we had that in common. So I started just as the old arena was closing and the new arena was opening up. So had you spent any time in the old arena, that, of course, for folks on the line who may not necessarily know the landscape of what we're talking about, which is now Festival Theatre?
Yeah, it would have been referred to prior to that as the Ice Palace. And I think, to be honest with you, I was in there maybe 2 or 3 times between arriving in the Valley, which was in 1984. I think, I don't even know if I watched a varsity hockey game in there. Not even sure if I skated. I just remember being in the building. I remember seeing the steps where the hockey players would have to walk up the steps to get to the locker room. And then, of course, in later years, I would hear all the stories, of people that played in that building, and I can't to this day figure out how they played a hockey game in that small barn.
Yeah. To say that the old arena and the new arena are complete antitheses of one another would be a bit of an understatement. Absolutely, but it still stands today in a much different regard. So when we were talking the other day, we were joking about whether or not you ever get tired of talking. And you had a bit of a funny story to tell me about your dad. You want to share that with folks on the line?
Well, when I was quite young, my dad, who was a military guy, and of course you heard everything around the house, being a military guy. But I can remember my dad. I used to be quite a talk box. I mean, I was very.
Used to be.
And my dad used to say on a fairly regular basis, "Boy, you're going to grow up to be a politician or a priest."
Yeah. So he certainly appreciated the fact that you had a skill set, and he didn't quite get the nail on the head, but he certainly knew you were destined for waters that engaged people in the spoken word. And I really appreciated what you said about David Bannerman, sort of training you or mentoring you on how to paint a picture for people. And thankfully I'm fortunate enough to be at a lot of or pretty much all of the home games, and fortunate enough to travel to some of the away games. But the ones that I'm not able to, and I hear you announcing those away games, painting the picture of what's happening on the ice is definitely a skill that you have. And I know that many people on the line today are likely with me in saying that it's like we're there when you're announcing the game, and certainly bringing it to our homes, our living rooms, our cars, wherever we are, and wherever we are listening to that game. So let's. Oh, sorry. Go ahead, Len.
Well, I was just going to say, what's funny about that, and about 2 or 3 days ago, my wife and I were in a mall, and she made the comment. She goes, "It's so hard to go out into public with you, sit in a mall because you don't pay attention to me, because I'm the type of person where I'm people watching, I'm seeing situations that are going on, and really when I'm doing the hockey games, that's basically what I do. It's just my natural, it's the nature of me, to be looking around and sort of taking everything in."
I thought for sure you were going to say that when you're out in public, people recognize you long before they see you because they hear your voice, and you've definitely got one of those voices that's easily identifiable, for sure. So let's narrow it down a little bit more on hockey, a little bit even more on hockey. Do you remember the first hockey game that you ever watched?
Yeah, my dad was transferred to Trenton, Ontario, and I'll preface this by saying, growing up, and I think we moved to Trenton when I was about 12. So growing up, my dad would sit in the living room when we lived in Shearwater, and he'd watch a game. And at that time, hockey night in Canada would be Wednesday night and Saturday night, and I absolutely despised hockey. If the game came on the television, I was out with my mom in the kitchen or outside playing with my friend. I didn't enjoy hockey. But we moved to Trenton, Ontario. We lived on the base, and I remember in the playoffs of the NHL that year. So I guess now we're talking 77 or 76. I watched the Toronto Maple Leafs and the Philadelphia Flyers, and I sort of got intrigued by the whole thing. And the next thing, I'm out on the road playing road hockey with some guys, and then Boston and Montreal played in the Stanley Cup final, and I absolutely fell in love with Guy Lafleur and Ken Dryden and the Canadians, and so that's where my love of hockey started.
So, as a Toronto Maple Leaf fan, what I picked up on that is that the first game you ever watched was one of the Toronto Maple Leafs. That's what I heard.
I can't lie. You're absolutely right.
Gotta get that in there wherever I can. I did hear you say that the Montreal Canadiens won the cup. I did hear you say that, and I've heard you say that many, many times. Did you ever play hockey yourself, and or do you still?
Yes and yes. So when we left Trenton, we moved back to Nova Scotia a year later, which I think was 77. And I think the year after that, I might have been 14, I decided that I wanted to play hockey. And I remember my dad had the old-fashioned hockey skates. He went out and bought me all kinds of new hockey gear. But all I had were his old skates. And I mean, these were the skates the guys wore in the 50s and the 60s. And so I went to my first practice, ankles down to the ice. And it was, I mean, the kids were laughing at me. People were just like, oh my goodness, where did he come from? Because most of them had played from probably 4 or 5 in minor hockey. And anyway, it didn't take too long, and Dad got me a new pair of skates. And it was a guy that was a great hockey star at St. Mary's. He was a school teacher in Eastern Passage, and his name was Dennis Noggle. In fact, I still see Dennis at hockey games between Acadia and St. Mary's, and we always have a good chat. But every Saturday morning, Dennis would host a power skating school in Shearwater, and my dad always made sure I was there for that hour, and I learned so much. And so my skating, I've never been a great skater, I'll say that, but my skating improved immensely in a 12-month period, and I give Dennis a lot of credit for that.
And how about now?
I still play. Yeah, I'm old timer. I'm starting to wind down a little bit. I want to play sort of like once a week, but for the last 30 years, it's always been, 2 nights a week and going to the rink. I always I enjoy playing the game, but at the same time, it's the camaraderie of being around, guys you play hockey with and stuff, and hearing stories after the game and stuff. So I still enjoy it. Yeah, I don't think I'll ever hang up the skates. I'll play it at some level, but yeah.
And do you still have that first pair of skates?
No. A few military moves across the country and some things have disappeared, so those were definitely gone.
You mean they're not in a glass case, sort of situated on your wall at home or in your office?
No, long gone.
Hanging from your rear view mirror, maybe?
With the teaching I got from some of my buddies at 13, 14 years old, I wanted those skates as far away from me as possible.
I bet. That reminds me of a green helmet that my parents insisted that I wear, and I felt the same way about that green helmet. So listen, you've mentioned your dad several times in the course of your answers so far. I certainly know you look like him. I know we saw a picture recently of you and your dad, and you were the spitting image, as we would say. So talk to me a little bit about the influence that your dad has had, in addition to the references that you've made so far.
Well, dad was the pillar of the family, and like he was a military guy, so he could have that sort of tough, stern side to him. He was a teddy bear at heart, and he was the problem solver in the family. Whether it was between him and mom, or me or one of my brothers, and situations that you face, growing up and stuff. And he was always the guy that was there for you. And he passed away in '06, and I still say to this day, I mean, I miss him dearly, but he really was the pillar, and he influenced me for sure so much. I remember when we lived in Edmonton, and I think I was 17 or 18. We lived there for about a year, and I was allowed to play on the squadron hockey team. They were allowed to have two non-military people, and so I played on the team. And every time we played the game, I'd come home and I might be frustrated after the game, and it was always my line. My line didn't perform. I didn't like, and he would always get mad at me. Not so mad at me, but he'd always point out that it's not your line. And so he was always talking a little bit about teamwork versus being an individual. And so I learned a lot from there. And he was the pillar of the family for sure. And he was a great guy in that, like all my friends growing up, they loved being around my parents. They were fun to be around. And my dad was a prankster at heart. So he was a lot of fun.
Did your mom and or dad follow a particular hockey team?
You know what? Dad never ever let his guard down. But I will tell you this: whenever we would get together watching hockey, and this was right up until he passed away, if I was cheering for a particular team, he would go the opposite way. And I know to this day he did it just to irk me.
Sounds like such a dad thing to do. What about your siblings? You mentioned some brothers. Tell us about the rest of the family.
Yeah, so I have two younger brothers. Peter's about 3 years younger than I am, and lives just outside Middleton. And then Rob, who's 6 or 7 years younger than I am, actually works for a physical plant at Acadia University, and he's actually an Acadia grad. And he also went to Mount A, and he taught some English overseas in Japan and Korea. So but he's back. We're all three of us are in the Valley now.
Great. Awesome. So a lot of Acadia influences throughout the family then. So folks, I'm going to keep going with the questions that I have here, but I do want to remind you all that I don't need to hog the air time and Len's time. I'm going to continue with some questions, but please feel free to write some questions in the chat function or enable your camera. And if I see you enable your camera, I assume that means you want to ask a question, and I'll certainly hand it over to you so that you can have your turn with getting to know Len Hawley. So let's talk about Acadia specifically and beginning to broadcast our Acadia games, and ask you, do you remember the first, and I'm sure you do, this is probably a ridiculous question to ask, but I guess what I'm looking for is a little bit of detail on the first Acadia hockey game that you ever broadcast.
I do. I remember the circumstances. The radio station had decided to broadcast the playoff games that Acadia played on the road. So Acadia played against the St. Thomas Tommies. So this probably would have been about February '89, I would say. And so they decided to send me and Dave Chalk, who was our news director, sports director, he might have been sports director at the time, on Air Nova from Halifax to Fredericton. We would broadcast the game and catch a red eye back to Halifax and be back to work the next morning. What they failed to calculate was that the game might go into overtime, and we played a double overtime game that night. Mike Arthur, who scored the winning goal, and Acadia won that game at St. Thomas that night. And so when we went off the air, Dave realized we missed our flight. And Dave, if anybody knows Dave Chalk, who's been on radio for years in the Valley, Dave's well over 6 feet tall. And the thoughts of him sitting on that bus to come all the way back to the Valley. And at that time, we didn't have twinned highways like we have today. So a Fredericton to Wolfville drive was probably a good 7 hours. Dave was not a happy camper, and he let everybody know about it.
So you travel back with the team then?
So we came back in the bus. We had no choice. We missed our flight, and so thankfully Coach Coolin at the time was receptive to letting us jump on the bus and come home.
So that was going to be one of my questions. Was that in fact the only time that you traveled with the team, or did that sort of happen along the years at various points in times for various reasons?
You know what? In the early days, Oonagh, I traveled on my, and then a lot of times I had a color commentator, so we would travel together, and we usually take one of the radio vehicles, and we travel to wherever we were going. It wasn't until Kevin Dickey came along and started coaching the team in '97 or '98 that I started jumping on the bus, and so those were my bus trips.
All right, tell us a funny story about a bus trip. There's got to be something that stands out in your mind, or something just in general. Bring us on the bus with you. Let us know what that looks like, or I was going to say or smells like, but no, never mind. Let's leave that out of the conversation.
Oh my goodness. I mean, you could tell so many stories, and some I'd be allowed to tell you and some that I wouldn't. But I can remember when Aaron Burns took over as the hockey coach in the early 2000s. I think it was 2001. And for the first couple of years, and I can't remember the bus company. But anyway, we had all kinds of problems with the bus. Sometimes they have a leaky roof, so anyway, this one particular year, he took the team to Montreal, and they would play 2 exhibition games. I think McGill was one of the teams. I can't remember the other one. And on our way up, the bus had all kinds of electrical problems, and the lights would all of a sudden go off, and there was all kinds of issues. So anyway, we go up for the 2 or 3 days around Montreal, play the games, and we're on our way home, and I believe it's like a Sunday night, and we're passing Spring Hill, and it's midnight. And all of a sudden, the interior lights went off, the exterior lights went off, every light on the bus shut down. Thankfully, we're on a twinned highway, and there's not a lot of traffic. And I sat right behind the bus driver, and at the time, Jim Midgley was an assistant coach sitting next to me. And I'm sure that Jim's fingerprints are still in my knees, and maybe my fingerprints are in his knees where we grabbed on, because you couldn't see anything. It was pitch black. And to this day, I don't know how the bus driver stopped the bus. Anyway, we had to unload and get on a school bus at, like, again, 1 o'clock in the morning. And so there's a lot of bus memories, trust me.
And all for the game of hockey.
All for the game of hockey.
All for the game of hockey. So we have a comment that Stephen Richards says maybe it was a Perry Rand bus, ? So
I'm not throwing any companies under the bus.
So talk to me about your biggest thrill. Like, there's got to be something that stands out for you that was sort of in terms of your broadcasting career, what kind of is like, oh my goodness, I can't believe this is happening to me.
Well, it certainly would be the Acadia hockey. And, when the arena opened in '88, you could see the program had turned a corner, and it was becoming more competitive, not just in the conference, but you could tell this was a team that had an opportunity to compete at the highest level in the country. And so by '92, the team went to nationals and lost to the University of Alberta. And then in '93, they go to Maple Leaf Gardens, and I get the opportunity to go up and broadcast the game. And of course, that was the year that Acadia beats Toronto 12-1 in the national final. The media in Toronto were all over Acadia the day after. Just couldn't understand where all these guys came from. Acadia must have all these pro guys, and it wasn't the case at all. But Tom had built a powerhouse of a program. But for me personally, to your question, to sit in Maple Leaf Gardens where people like Bob Cole and Foster Hewitt sat to broadcast games, and I'm there calling that game, and such a memorable one with Acadia winning, that's the one that stands out.
Listen, Len, I got to tell you, I have absolute goosebumps from that story for any number of reasons. Being a grad of '93, I remember it well. Obviously, I didn't have the seat that you had, so I remember it well. And also, I got to point out yet again, your biggest thrill is there's a reference to the Maple Leafs. I mean, I got to tell you, I think there's something going on there that you're just resisting being a Toronto Maple Leaf fan.
Well, you know what? I'm a bit of a closet Leafs fan. If the half out of it, then I'll cheer for Toronto. But of course, I'd let the secret out of the bag, but I usually try not to promote that too much.
So I do remind you that this session is being recorded, and that is now officially on record. My job here is done. Talk to me about the greatest game. I mean, that's got to be an absolute amazing experience and game that you've just referenced. But what about, is there another sort of standout game for you that you would maybe categorize as the greatest game?
Well, it's funny because I'm asked that question a lot, having watched so many Acadia hockey games. And believe it or not, it's the same year, Oonagh. So Acadia wins nationals in March that year. The University of Maine Black Bears won the national championship in the United States. So in the fall, Acadia goes to Maine, and there was a lot of buildup at the Alfond Arena in Maine for the two national teams to go head to head. It's Canada versus the US, it's Acadia versus Maine. And when I had arrived there, it was such a different atmosphere. And the place was packed. And I think at the time they had told me it was 6 straight years of sellouts. This is where they have students with a live band in the audience. There's over 6,000 people. The place was just electric. And Acadia has most of its team from the national championship still together. And Maine has this incredible lineup where they had 7 guys that were drafted into the National Hockey League, which included Paul Kariya, who had an outstanding NHL career. And so it was, to this day, the greatest game that I've ever watched in university hockey. And I was fortunate enough to be able to call it because the radio station had agreed to let's do it. They typically didn't do exhibition games, but in this case, they made an exception. And we went down and broadcast the game. It was a 4-4 tie, and it was the best game I've ever watched.
That's incredible. That sounds like a fantastic experience, and no wonder that you're not quick to forget it. I'm sure it'll live on with you for many, many years to come. Again, that was a big year for you, apparently, 1993. So tell me a little bit about, actually, you know what? I do have to sidebar and just say that one of our guests, Helena, hi, it's nice to see you online again with us. She says the actual correct NHL team to cheer for is the Winnipeg Jets, just for the record. So we're getting a little bit of lively banter coming from our guests now, which is great. So in 2006, you were honored by being inducted into the Acadia Axemen Hockey Honors Roll. Talk to us about your emotions and your reactions when that happened.
Well, you know what? That was in the fall that year, and it was it was a bit emotional because my dad had passed away in June, and then I was told that I was being inducted in the fall, and I remember it was in the old auxiliary gymnasium, which is now the fitness center at Acadia, where they hosted the event. And I remember my mom and my brother coming up and being there and being part of it. And I won't lie to you, it was certainly it was tugging at my heart, that my dad wasn't there. He would have been absolutely so proud. And so, yeah, but to be recognized for the contributions I've made to the hockey program by Coach Burns and other people, that was very special to me. And I have the little plaque in the background that sits here in my office. So yeah, that was it was very nice. And like I said, it was emotional simply because my dad hadn't been there to be part of it.
Absolutely. You've joined the ranks of many great people before your induction and since your induction, and rightly so, Len. The contribution that you bring to the hockey program is above and beyond what I'm sure many other hockey programs are even remotely able to lay claim to. And I'm sure I'm not alone in singing your accolades on that. So what are some of your sort of highlights when you look at the year, when it's sort of this year aside, because we're going to get to that in a moment, but when you sort of look at the lay of the land of the year ahead of you once a season starts, or depending on if you consider a year starting in January or September or whenever you consider a year starting, what are some of the highlights that you look forward to in your year as it stands now? I mean, sort of in your current role and what you're doing with the Acadia program or outside of the program.
Well, certainly, from the varsity sports, looking at it from 40,000 feet, I'm always excited to be able to see the newcomers to a program, and what kind of impact they're going to have. And it's always fun to be able to watch an athlete grow from the day they arrive to the day you watch them walk across the stage and accept their degree, their diploma. And I mean, that's what I really enjoy. But in terms of going into the season, it's it depends on the program. There's some programs this year that have a good core of say veteran players that are coming back that should compete. So you're always excited about seeing how they're going to perform. And then every coach obviously tinkers with his or her lineup by bringing in new player and how are they going to fit into the puzzle. And I always enjoy watching the building of a program. It's so much fun. I mean, it's great when you get to the point where you're hanging a banner and you won a championship, but really the process of watching the program be built is what I enjoy the most.
Awesome. We have a question from the audience. Steve says, do you miss having a color commentary person in the booth to interact with during the games?
Absolutely, and unfortunately, economies and stuff like that and business practices, things changed probably about 10 years ago. And I know for probably about 10 years, Mark Pound was my sidekick. And in fact, Mark and I ended up doing a little TV. I used to laugh that I had a face for radio, but Eastlink Television had invited us to broadcast the Halifax Moosehead games for a season. So we did that, I don't know, maybe 9 or 10 times. Sidney Crosby was still playing in junior hockey, played for Rimouski, and so that was a thrill because we did broadcast a game with Sid in it. But yeah, no, I do, Steve. I do miss having a sidekick, and but at the same time, I understand how things work. And you know what? It's a big commitment. Mark was got into the teaching profession, and I think he still teaches in Sackville, and it was becoming more and more challenging for him to be able to get away from the classroom on a Friday afternoon to get to Fredericton. And so there's been different people over the years that have sort of jumped in, Darren Cruselbrink and Jeff Wilson and Billy Walsh, and some people that have all, Robbie Sutherland did it with me for a little bit, and a few others. So yeah, I do miss it. I won't lie to you.
So you mentioned some coaches, a couple of coaches' names along the way, and you talked about one of the things you're looking forward to is sort of watching a team form. And I must admit, I was going to save these questions for the last, but I'm going to jump in now because it was a perfect little segue to it and put you on the spot a little bit here and say, you know what? And it's a bit part A, part B, but I'll just give it to you both at the same time and put you on the spot and ask you, over the years and years of watching the Acadia Axemen, who are some of the players that you really enjoyed watching? And that's, I understand, not to say that you probably enjoyed watching them all, but you got to have a couple of names that are standouts for you. And the part B is a little bit on the coaching and some of the coaching that you've enjoyed watching. So it's a part A, part B, and you're not getting off the spot on this one.
Oh boy, you know what? I thought you might ask me this question, so I was sort of putting things in my mind in categories. So in terms of watching players, boy, it's a loaded question. I'm going to tell you that right now. Certainly in the early 90s when Acadia was really successful, to see a guy like Dwayne Dennis, and he was a magician on the ice, and the year that he had 70 or 71 points, that was just unheard of. When you consider most guys now that lead the league are usually 45 or 47 points, and to think Dennis had that many points, he was so much fun to watch. Ward Carlson was on the team when I started covering it in '88, and he was a comic, and he still is. Of course, if you go to alumni events, you know what Wardy's like. But that's the way he was around the team, and he was so much fun to be around. Another guy is Greg Clancy in the middle of the '90s, was a great captain. Had a tremendous line with Jason Weaver and Wade Whitten. I just loved watching them play. Paul Doherty was one of my all-time favorite defensemen. I don't think I've ever seen anybody shoot the puck the way Paul did. And then you get into the 2000s. Bryce Klassen. Bryce Klassen to me is, he may not have been the guy that was going to get 40 or 50 points every year, but he was such a well-rounded person on and off the ice. I thought he was, he was recruited by Kevin Dickey, and I just think the world of Bryce. We're still friends and communicate regularly. Paul McFarland was a great captain. Robbie Sutherland was somebody else that I always enjoyed, watching play. So, yeah, it's a loaded question, Oonagh. And then as far as the coaches go, I mean, really, you think about it, since I started covering the program in '88, there's only been 3 coaches. And it would have been Tom Coolin, who I consider the trailblazer for the program. And that's no disrespect to people like Don Wells and to Major Kelly, who had been there for so long. But Tom had sort of changed the recruiting model. And if you go back to Major Kelly and even to Don, guys were coming out of high school to play university hockey. And then when Tom came along in the mid '80s, you started to see this trend of more major junior hockey players. And he had a pipeline from the West. Of these guys that were coming to Acadia, and that's when he built the powerhouse. And then Kevin came along in around '97, '98, and you couldn't describe 2 people differently. I mean, Tom was one personality and Kevin was another personality, and then Darren was, when he came in 2001, was yet another. So there's only been 3 coaches in my 32 years of covering the program.
Absolutely. And your comment about recruiting players, I mean, certainly it's also a sort of a sign of the times and a nature of the beast and what that beast looked like at the time. So in the time frame that you were referencing, I mean, recruiting was starting to look very different, as you say. Sort of resources available in terms of recruiting players and even simple things like communicating and getting players here and that type of thing, I'm sure must have been taking a bit of a change and a bit of a turn by the time it sort of moved past as you say, Major Kelly and Don Wells, and into the time of Tommy Coolin for sure. And having met a lot of the players who played for Coach Coolin, so many of the stories began with his recruiting efforts, right? When the players talk about when Coolin would contact them and say, "Hey, I want to recruit you. Let's start talking."
You know what's interesting when Tom was recruiting all these great players, and again, you go back to 88, 89, you could see the program starting this upswing, and they would become more competitive each year. And I can remember sort of the armchair coaches at the time would sit around and maybe a little bit critical of Tommy and say, he's a great recruiter, but he's not a great coach. And I was always a defender of Tom. And I always used the comparison in the NHL was the Edmonton Oilers. And if you go back to the early 80s when Gretzky and Messier and Coffey and Anderson and Fuhr and all those guys were winning games every night, but they couldn't win the championship. And they had to learn how to win. And Glenn Sather had to learn how to coach and adjust with the times. And it wasn't until 84 that they won the cup. Well, I think the same thing could be said about Tom. He was such a great recruiter. And sometimes your greatest coach, when you have that many talented players on any team, that's when your true colors show. But it took a little bit of time to massage the program and get it to where he wanted it to be. And I consider him a great coach.
Absolutely, absolutely. Appreciate that insight. And in terms of the players that you've referenced, I mean, it's some great names in there, right? And when you're as long in the tooth as you and I are, you say those names and you bring me right back to the early 90s and sitting in the new arena and taking in the games. I mean, born and raised in Newfoundland, I never saw a live hockey game until I got here to overseas to Wolfville, Nova Scotia, and saw my first live hockey game. I mean, there were many evenings spent in that event with that, as you use the word electricity, right? And it's great stuff. So one of the milestones that you mentioned in your career path is in 1994 when you began managing your wife's music career. But the part of the story that's missing is how you met your wife. Give us a little background on that one. Let's segue completely away from hockey for a couple of minutes, Len.
So look, yeah, Rachel had called me, and I was on radio in Middleton at the time, and asked me if I would come and MC a concert that she and her sister were putting on at the local theater. And I remember in the course of the conversation, she asked what my charge was to MC, and I said, "Oh no, I don't." I never charged when I went out into the community. So anyway, she was a little taken back that I wouldn't charge them any money. Anyway, I went and I heard them sing, and I was just blown away by their harmonies and stuff. And anyway, we got to know each other away from the stage a little bit, and I said, "Look, I can help you out a little bit and connect you." And I remember in the first year or so, I was booking them into. We had a circuit of probably 5 or 6 pubs, and at that time, Rachel and her sister were doing a lot of maritime stuff, the Rankins and the Barra McNeils and what have you. And so they would go into pubs in Kentville and Greenwood and Digby, and just before I had met Rachel, CBC Radio in Halifax had sort of discovered them and brought them in to do some recording and stuff. And so they sort of had a mentor, and his name was Glenn Meisner. He was a great producer at Studio H in Halifax. And anyway, so Glenn caught wind of what I was doing and booking them into these pubs to the Maritime. In fact, Rachel's sister, we had to get a special form because she was underage. She wasn't even allowed. She wasn't a drinking age, if you will, to be in these pubs. So we had to get a special form for her to go in and sing. Anyway, Glenn Meisner finds out that this is what I'm doing. So we're probably around 95 at this point, and he takes me aside and he says, "Get those 2 girls out of the pubs right now." And so we really had to find what our niche was. And yeah, singing in pubs with people sitting around having a few refreshments and stuff wasn't. And he was right. He was 100% right.
Yeah, absolutely. So you announce games. You've been a DJ. You're married to a singer. You were humming at the beginning of this session before folks started to sign on. Do you sing, and are you gonna hum us a few bars or sing us a few lines?
No.
You're gonna leave the musical talent to your lovely wife, are you?
Well, it's funny. In prepping for this a little bit and just sort of putting my thoughts together, I said to my wife, I said, "What if Oonagh asked me a question like, tell us something that we wouldn't know about you?" And she said, "Well, you have to tell him that you can sing." So Rachel really believes that I can sing, and the only reason that she ever knew is when the one of the girls was really young. We had the baby monitors, and I would go in and obviously, you'd hum them and I had no idea that it was on that she was listening. So I was caught. So other than that, one time, Oonagh, nobody ever hears me sing.
Oh, I love the baby monitor stories. That's fantastic. Next time, next time, will there be a baby monitor next time? No, I'm just kidding. In terms of catching you off guard, maybe we'll be able to do that someday. So maybe it's a segue into that sort of famous question that you got to put people on the spot every now and again with. And what's your most embarrassing moment? And don't go back to the baby monitor. No fair.
Boy, most embarrassing moment that I've ever had. Well, I'll tell you, because I tell this story a lot. It was the first year that I was hired to be the public address announcer in the arena. So Acadia brought in Moncton to play an exhibition game right after Christmas, sort of a warm up to the second half. And at that time, I was not only the announcer, but I also would control the score clock, the time clock above center ice. So I would sit down between the two penalty boxes on the ice. So in this particular game, Moncton was leading 3-2. And Acadia had the face-off of Moncton's end, and Acadia pulled their goaltender to try to get the tying goal. So Acadia wins the face-off, and there's a shot from the blue line that goes in, and the people in the building are going crazy. Acadia's tied the game with under 7 seconds to go. And you look across the ice, and you can see the Moncton bench going absolutely berserk, and they're looking up at the score clock. Yours truly didn't start the clock. So Charlie Banfield, who was a former professional referee, happened to be refereeing the game. He came over to where I was sitting, and there's a little circle that's cut out in the plexiglass where the referee can talk to the off-ice officials. And he bent down and he looked through the hole and he said, "Well, it's your call." I said, Charlie, they won the face-off. They shot the puck. It went in. It had to be in less than 7. And he points to center ice. It's a goal. And the Moncton, let's just say it wasn't pleasant. The game was over. Acadia tied it. There was no overtime then. And the Moncton players came over. There was a few sticks slapped against the glass. And
I bet. Gracious. That's,
so that would be it.
That would, I think I would have loved to have seen that, in fact. I must admit, when you tell that story, it brings me back a little bit to the story, certainly well before even mine and your time, about Connie McNeil's goals. What was it, 6 goals in 3 seconds or something? And did I get those two numbers right? But that's what's ringing in my memory, is to say that 3 goals in 6 seconds.
3 goals in 6. I'll tell you a really interesting story real quick. So this was 6 years ago, 2014. Acadia is playing Moncton in one of the playoff series, and we're down 3-0 after the first period to Moncton. And the date of the game was February 27th. Well, that happened to be the anniversary of Connie scoring the 3 goals in 6 seconds in 1950. So when I was on the air, I referenced it at the end of the first period, and I sort of looked skyward. Of course, you couldn't see me, but on the radio, I said, "Connie, if you're listening in tonight, we need your 3 goals in 6 seconds." Knowing, of course, we'd never score that in this day and age. So it's 5-2 now in the third period for Moncton, and Acadia scores 3 goals in 3 minutes to tie the game. Liam Heelis was the guy that led the charge on it. And Acadia won the game in double overtime that night. And it was on the anniversary of Connie doing it. We scored the 3 goals in 3 minutes and won that game and ended up winning the series.
No, that is incredible. And I kid you not, I literally have goosebumps from head to toe on that one. So I am so glad you shared that story. That's fantastic. That's one for the history books for sure. I have one last question for you, but before I get to it, I'm going to just offer it out there once again to make sure that I'm not missing anyone's who's looking for an opportunity to ask you a question, and say that it is in the to pop it in the chat function there as I address you with the last question, with a few minutes remaining in this hour with you, Len. And that is to talk to us a little bit about your feelings, your emotions, your reactions, where your headspace is heading into what's going to look like a very, very different year for us. And just not asking you to let anything out that maybe isn't carved in stone or planned or discussed yet, but just talk to us about it from a personal perspective and where you're at.
You know what? I feel for the student athletes. I feel for the coaches, for what they're dealing with, and hats off to them, the way they're dealing with it. It's great disappointment, and I particularly think about those student athletes that would be coming back to play in their 4th year or possibly their 5th year, and in the case of fall sports, soccer and football and rugby, those student athletes don't get an opportunity to play again, and so I even get a little emotional thinking about it. But at the same time, how I feel about it, and I can't even imagine how they feel. I feel lost. And here we are in the middle of September, and we haven't watched a football game, we haven't watched a soccer game or a rugby game, and it's so different. We're hopeful that, there's so many unknowns. We could get into the weeds of it. There's so many unknowns, but fingers crossed, and this pandemic doesn't get out of hand in the Atlantic bubble, and maybe we'll see some sports in January, February, and March. But a lot of hurdles have to be jumped before that happens.
Well, listen, you put a lot of positive energy out into that game that you just referenced when we needed the goals, and it was on February 27th, and you reached out and put that positive energy out there asking for a little guidance from Connie. So it sounds like you put some positive energy out there in the universe. It might turn around for us and help us out in this next little while in terms of the not knowing what the landscape looks like. And listen, when you reference that one, just back in March when we're sitting there at the Hockey Nationals and you're getting the word that it's not going to turn out the way we thought it was going to turn out, you're right. You immediately think about the players, and then you think about all of us and how much we spend our time and energy and passion just watching our players and being there and feeling like we're right there on the ice with them. And sort of that community response and that community support won't go anywhere, as you and I well know, in terms of our Acadia family and people who are athletes, past athletes, alumni, faculty, staff, community members. I mean, you and I both know, being at all of the games, that community members in the area just love to come out and support our athletes in all of our city sports. So we certainly look forward to resuming that sometime in the very, very near future. So are there any other questions or comments from folks? I'm looking to see if there's any hand raised in the participant list there, or if there are any questions in the comments section. And I don't think I'm seeing any. So I'll just pause for a moment, because I, like you, Len, like to talk. So I'll pause for a moment and just see if anyone wants to come off mute and ask a question before we wrap it up for the evening.
Oh, can you guys hear me?
Absolutely can.
Okay.
Who's speaking,
Yeah.
please?
Oh, yeah, it's Rob Balcom here.
Hello.
Hi, Len. And
Hey, Rob.
Hi, calling from your favorite hockey town, Toronto. I'm a grad of '83, and I actually did have the chance to play a lot in the old barn. And I don't think there's many Acadia Axemen games that I missed during my time at Acadia. But I got two really quick questions, Len, and I really appreciated your talk. I really enjoyed it. But first question is, and I'm going to give you sort of an option here to pick one or the other. But okay. One is, have you ever in announcing a game ever said anything that after your words you regret? And I'm thinking of sort of the Mike Milbury type of scenario, which you'll relate to. So, because in the heat of the moment and the competitiveness of a game, you sometimes say things, oh, geez, I really put my foot in my mouth on that one. And after the game, when you go home and sort of chill down, you say, I shouldn't have said that. Or, and here's sort of where you get the option, after a game, you miss saying something that you wish you had said. So that's question number one. And then question number two, and it's sort of, picking up on the last discussion there and the theme of how things have changed. Len, I'd be interested in knowing your thoughts on, does the role of the hockey broadcaster change when there's no fans in the building? So two questions. The first one, you get to pick which of those two that you want to sort of answer. The most embarrassing thing you said that you was sort of insensitive or insulting, or something that you miss saying. And then the second question is, in today's world, you know, and now with all the hockey, you know, the Stanley Cup playoffs on, how do you see the role of the announcer with no one in the arenas?
Thanks, Rob. You know what? I'll tackle question one. I'll try to give you the Coles Note version of this. And this is, I got my hand slapped in my, I don't know, probably fourth or fifth year. So we're in Cape Breton and I'm broadcasting a game. I got to be good friends with John Allen Cameron, the godfather of Celtic music from Cape Breton. And so the weekend that we were in Cape Breton broadcasting the game, which was on the campus of what was University College of Cape Breton, the East Coast Music Awards were on. So we're probably around 95, I think it was 95. John Allen was receiving the ECMA for Lifetime Achievement, and he was in town for it. So I called him, and John Allen was a huge hockey fan. In fact, when Don Cherry had his Grapevine television show, John Allen was the music guest on most of those programs. And of course, John Allen had his own TV show and what have you. So I called him and I said, look, we're in town, we're playing hockey. Love for you to come over and watch the game. So he comes over. And he goes down and actually addresses the Axemen team before the game. And he tells them a couple of funny hockey stories. And I had him on the broadcast, I think, in the second intermission or something like that. Anyway, we go out and we pummel Cape Breton like it's one of those 12-2 games. And, you know, so he got to meet Coach Coolin. And he said, look, we're having an after-hours kitchen party at, I think it was the Delta Sydney. And he said, you guys are all welcome to come. So, of course, me and Tom and a couple of the other coaches, the players obviously had to go back to the hotel. And we had to play St. FX the next afternoon. So we go there. And of course, it's a lot of fun. Ashley McIsaac and Natalie McMaster, all kinds of people coming and going, and fiddles are going till all hours. It was a lot of fun. We had a great time. Anyway, long story short, the next day we're at St. FX. I'm broadcasting the game, and I reference John Allen inviting us out. And I said, just innocently, yeah, it was neat to see Coach Coolin doing the Celtic two-step. Well, Tommy's wife heard it.
Yeah.
And we got home and on the Monday I saw Tom and he took me aside. He goes, I'm going to tell you something. What goes on the road stays on the road.
Yeah.
So yeah, that's the one that I regret. I should have kept my my lips closed on that one, Rob. But in terms of today, it's funny, you know, like I'm watching the sports on TV, the NHL and the Raptors that just lost, unfortunately, and the Blue Jays, and I'm thinking of these announcers, and because the crowd really influences sort of, you know, if it's a crowd that's really into it, Rob, you get really into it. And I look at these guys that are sitting in these empty arenas, and I think the only thing they have going for them, other than obviously the games are great, is that they're pumping in some crowd effects. And so you might pick up on that. But boy, it would be a different, I'm sure if we were to talk to Chris Cuthbert at Hockey Night in Canada or Buck Martinez doing the Jays games, and they find it really challenging. So I give those guys a lot of credit. That would not be an easy thing to do. Having said that, I mean, Acadia goes into some buildings where they're lucky to have 100 people, you know, or 200 people watching their games, unlike at Acadia. And so it's pretty quiet, but you get caught up in the game pretty quick. But at the same time, when you have a crowd into it, it just adds so much to it.
All right. Good. Thanks.
Yeah, no, you're welcome.
Thanks so much, Rob. Those were great questions, and thank you, Len. So, folks, that wraps up our time together this evening. And I don't know about you, Len, but that time certainly flew by for me. And I just want to say on behalf of everyone here this evening to thank you so much for giving your time and giving of yourself with us in this interview. You know what, I've heard you interview for many, many, many years, and I was really looking forward to this one. And of course, you did not disappoint. So I do appreciate it. Got to tell you, between you and Rachel, you got a pretty talented family there. And thank you so much for the time and your honesty and your description and your you know what I'm trying to say, candidness this evening. And you know what, you just answered that question of Rob's about what it's like to announce without folks being around. And I'm going to ask you just before we wrap up, one more thing before we wrap up, that we did have a draw prize, and I'm happy to announce that Stephen Richards, who I believe is on the line with us this evening, is the winner of the draw prize. So we'll be getting that out to you, Stephen, a little swag package as a thanks for joining us for this evening. He says yay, so he's pretty excited. And thank everyone for joining us this evening. And before we wrap up, Len, do you think you could pull off a you know, sort of skating down the ice and the famous words when, come on, you got to do it for us.
Oh boy, you're putting me on the spot here. Like,
yeah.
Song. He scores. How's
There
that?
it is. Thanks so much, Len, and thank you, everybody. Enjoy the rest of your evening, and we'll see you again soon. Good night.